land stretched out in all directions, like a forgotten hymn-dry grass, whispering in the wind. Fence posts half buried in dust, and a ranch house so weather-worn it seemed to lean against the horizon just to keep from falling. Silas McCrae stood at the edge of it, a saddlebag in one hand and his grandfather's cane in the other. His left leg stiff as old timber beneath him. He'd paid $1 for the deed, $1, and the last ounce of belief that something good could still come of him. The town of Calico Hollow called it a cursed place. McAllen's Folly, they said, a ranch that broke men as quick as it swallowed cattle. Silas didn't care. A man with nothing has little to lose and even less to prove. The war had taken his nerve, and Georgia had taken what was left of his pride. Here, with only wind for company and sky for ceiling, he hoped maybe silence would be kinder. The house wasn't empty. He noticed it first in the way the porch boards lacked dust. One step was darker than the rest, worn with recent tread. A rusted pan leaned against the wall, but the tin cup beside it was clean, a film of dew still clinging to the rim. Something stirred in the shadows behind the window, too quick for certainty, too slow for wind. Silas said nothing. He simply nodded once, as if the house itself had greeted him, then stepped inside. The floor groaned under his weight. He let it. He didn't search the corners, or call out. If someone was here, they'd show themselves when they were ready, or not at all. That night, the air turned cold fast. Autumn had come early in Calico Hollow. Silas lit no fire, not wanting to draw attention. Still, he lay awake long after the sky bruised to black, listening. A soft scrape, a creak near the back door. The shifting weight of someone too careful for a thief. Morning brought no footprints, but the kettle on the stove, he was sure, had been moved, just slightly, just enough. Silas gathered water from the nearby stream and boiled it. He poured half into a cracked cup and left it on the porch rail. The other half he drank slowly, eyes scanning the prairie for movement. By the third day, a pattern began. He'd leave behind something smaller: matchbook, a hard biscuit, a strip of jerky folded in paper. The next morning, it would be gone. In return, his tools were organized. His boots, left in a heap, were found neatly aligned by the door. A presence without confrontation. A shadow with kindness. He saw her first at dusk. Silas had been cutting the broken gate loose when he sensed it, that tightening of air that comes before you're seen. He turned slowly. She stood at the edge of the barn, barefoot, her dress a loose thing patched with old curtain fabric and sun-bleached to near white. A shotgun hung from her arms, too big for her small frame, but steady. Her hair was a dark halo of wild curls, her eyes fixed and wary. No threat in her body, but no welcome either. "I won't ask you to go," Silas said, voice low like a hymn half remembered. "If this is your place, then I'll share it. If not, I'll leave it better than I found it." She didn't speak, only watched, and after a breath, she stepped back into the shadows of the barn, disappearing like a deer into thicket. The wind picked up that night. Silas sat on the porch, wrapping his coat tighter. He thought about the girl, her silence, her steadiness, the way she didn't flinch. He thought about himself too, and how long it had been since someone had looked at him without pity or disgust. In town, they talked. He rode in once a week for flour and coffee. At the general store, the whispers trailed him like smoke, war-damaged. That one bought the haunted place. Can you believe it? Mrs. Marlowe, all starch and suspicion, peered at him from behind the counter. "That land's not meant for decent folks," she said, loud enough to be heard across the room. "Rumors say there's a girl up there, lives in the walls like a ghost. Wild thing, might be dangerous." Silas looked her in the eye. "Then, she and I'll get along just fine." He rode back in silence, the sack of supplies bouncing against his saddle. He didn't bring up the girl again in town, not in his own head. But that night, he left half the bread loaf on the porch beside the cup. In the morning, it was gone. Days passed. one folding into the next, like old linens. The ranch did not welcome him, not outright, but it didn't spit him out either. Silas rebuilt the corral with splintered wood. He patched the roof, plank by plank, with tar-soaked hands in silent prayer. When a nail rolled out of reach, he found it later placed neatly beside his hammer. He stopped thinking of her as a ghost. One evening, as the sky bruised to violet, he found a plate waiting for him on the porch, warm beans and a biscuit. The crust browned, just so. It wasn't charity, it was conversation, a language of gestures. She never showed herself, but her presence softened. Doors no longer creaked shut. A window remained open, just a crack. The air between them shifted from caution to something like recognition. Silas stood beneath the porch beam, holding the plate in both hands. He didn't eat right away. Instead, he whispered into the quiet, "Thank you." No answer, but the wind carried the scent of wood smoke from the barn, steady and calm. That night, he dreamt not of war or fire or falling. He dreamt of a woman, standing at a doorway, not running, not hiding, just watching him and letting him stay. When he woke, there were fresh boot prints beside his, not large ones, not hurried ones, just steps beside steps, as though someone had stood with him for a moment, long enough to feel the morning sun before vanishing again. He sat on the porch and looked out, over the land that had once been worth a fortune, now sold for a single coin. It didn't matter. Some things weren't measured in gold. Some things had their own kind of value, and whoever she was, whatever she'd lost, or feared or learned to live without, she hadn't left neither, would he? The first time she stepped into daylight, Silas nearly mistook her for something imagined, like a story you half recall from childhood, all missed in shape and quiet meaning. She stood in the barn's wide mouth, barefoot still, but steadier than before. Sunlight caught the edges of her hair and turned it almost bronze. She didn't speak, didn't wave, didn't smile. Just watched him driving nails into a split fence post, the hammer's rhythm slow and steady like a heartbeat. Silas didn't look up. He sensed her presence like one feels the approach of rain, not sudden, but certain. When he finished the row, he straightened and nodded in her direction. "There's no need to hide," he said. "I'm not here to take anything." She said nothing, but the next morning, the pail he used to draw water had been scrubbed clean. The coffee tin had been filled with roasted chicory root. It was how she answered through small acts, quiet and sure. Willa, that's what he came to call her in his thoughts. The name seemed to suit her, wild and willow-thin, with roots hidden deep beneath everything. He still hadn't heard her speak, but by then, words felt almost unnecessary. They worked in parallel. He fixed the porch. She swept the dust away before nightfall. He chopped wood. She stacked it neatly by the door. She always stayed just far enough to remain unclaimed, but close enough to be felt. Sometimes he'd catch her reflection in a window pane. Sometimes her humming, faint as a lullaby, would drift through the rafters as he stirred beans in the kitchen. One evening, a storm rose out of nowhere, the kind that twists itself from wind and memory, pressing hard on old bones and buried grief. Silas stood at the edge of the pasture, watching clouds churn like smoke. Lightning forked across the sky. Thunder rolled in a way that reminded him of cannon fire and horses screaming. He turned toward the house, toward the barn, toward her. He found her crouched inside the kitchen, beneath the table, hands pressed over her ears, eyes wide and unfocused. Glass had shattered from the window, the wind raging through every crack. Her shoulders shook, but not from the cold. Fear had rooted her there. He didn't reach for her, didn't speak. Instead, he eased himself down beside her, his body creaking with age and injury. For a moment, neither moved. Rain beat against the walls like fists, and then quietly, steadily he extended his hand, not toward her, but palm up on the floor. Between them, a long silence passed. Then she placed her fingers in his, light as a leaf falling. When the storm passed, they sat on the porch, wet and shivering, but unbroken. She hadn't said a word. Still, something had changed. The air between them no longer held only caution, it held memory, and maybe even trust. The next day, the world smelled of wet earth and pine. The corral fence was gone, ripped free in the wind. The roof had lost a few shingles, but the house still stood. So did they. Silas returned to town for supplies. At the general store, the whispers were louder now. Mrs. Marlowe narrowed her eyes and gestured toward the scar on his cheek. She's still out there, isn't she? That girl. You ought to be careful. No telling what she's capable of. Silas set a bag of flour on the counter. She's capable of silence, of kindness, of surviving when most wouldn't. Marlowe leaned in, voice thin and sharp. She's not right. Folks remember what happened on that land. Her family burned in that house. People said she wandered out days later, barefoot, near dead. She's touched. You let her stay, and they'll start saying you are too. Silas met her gaze without flinching. Let them. He didn't wait for his change. He rode home with the sun behind him and the scent of judgment trailing like dust. By the time he reached the ranch, the sky had turned orange and forgiving. A stew pot simmered on the back porch. There were 2 bowls set and a spoon resting across each. That night, he found her sitting near the hearth, legs curled beneath her, eyes on the fire. Silas took the chair opposite. Silence passed between them, soft and warm. Then she looked up. I used to dream of fire, she said, her voice like sand brushed over stone. But now, I dream of water. Silas didn't respond. He simply nodded and let the moment stretch. It was the first time he'd heard her voice. He'd remember every syllable. They began to speak more after that, but sparingly. Their language was still mostly gestures, a coat left folded, boots turned toward the door, coffee poured without being asked. Yet each word spoken grew roots between them. Neither needed much, but they needed each other. One morning, while fixing the chicken coop, Silas caught her watching him with a look he couldn't quite name. Not affection, not yet, but something warmer than caution. He wiped his brow and tilted his head. What is it? She hesitated, then shrugged. You don't fix things fast. He chuckled. Don't live fast either. I used to think if I stopped moving, the past would catch me. He leaned on his cane, gaze steady. And now? Willa glanced toward the hills, where the wind combed the grass into waves. Now I think maybe the past gets tired too. Maybe it just wants somewhere quiet to rest. That night, he built a bench for the porch. She brought a cushion made from an old feed sack. Together, they sat and watched the stars bloom. No promises passed between them, just presence. Just the tender knowledge that neither had run away. Late. Summer slipped into fall. The trees burned gold and orange. A calm settled into the ranch, like an exhale after years of breath held too tight. Then one afternoon, Mrs. Marlowe arrived. She came not with gossip this time, but with accusation. She dismounted her buggy and stood with arms crossed in the yard. You've got no deed to her, she said. No name, no law says she belongs here. She ain't livestock, Silas replied. Marlowe's voice cut like a blade. You're both mad, and if something happens out here, don't say you weren't warned. Willa had stepped onto the porch during this. She didn't speak, but she stood tall, bare feet on wood, arms crossed like wind wouldn't move her. Marlowe's eyes narrowed. You think you've made something here, she hissed, but all you've done is delay the ruin. Silas turned to Willa. What do you think? Willa looked him in the eye, then spoke with quiet certainty. I think people ruin things they don't understand. But this place, ... it understands us. Marlowe left in a flurry of skirts and bitterness. That evening, Willa brought out 2 mugs of coffee and placed them on the porch rail. They sat side by side, legs brushing, shoulders still. The air smelled of wood smoke and early frost. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Used to," he said, "but now, there's something here I can't walk away from." Willa turned toward him. Her hand rested on the bench, close to his, not touching, but close enough that if he moved half an inch, they'd meet. He didn't. She didn't. But they sat like that a long while, until the stars came out. By morning, frost had kissed the ground, and still, the ranch stood. Still, the coffee steamed still. Two people shared something wordless, fragile, and unspoken, as if the land had chosen not to forget them, after all.